Good morning. My name is Ian Diamond, and I am the UK's national statistician. And I'm speaking to you this morning from Newport in South Wales, where the sun is shining magnificently, as it always is on the offices of the Office for National Statistics. I was reflecting as I was travelling to Newport this morning that 47 years ago, so 47 years ago, I don't know what you were doing 47 years ago, but 47 years ago, I was unbelievably excited. I was unbelievably excited because I was about to start to work with someone whose written work had blown my mind away. And we were going to be working on a project which was going to involve some pretty hard, actually some very hard for me, statistics, and had a real policy outcome at the end. And that piece of work, which took place over a couple of years, 47 years ago, was unbelievably exciting. But I knew nothing 47 years ago about what would make it work. And it became pretty clear to me when I started doing the work that I could not sit in a darkened room doing the algebra and then hope that somehow someone would pick this up. It became pretty clear to me that the way to work was going to be involving not only policy professionals, but also the potential beneficiaries. And that became my mantra for the rest of my career, 47 years of it thus far and counting. And on many occasions, I've been incredibly privileged to work on areas which have used quite complex statistics, sometimes requiring new statistical methods, but always driven in partnership with policy experts and critically the potential beneficiaries. And I would have to say that some of those new statistical methods came about because people who were not statisticians in any way asked interesting questions, and together we worked out the questions, and together you thought, I don't know how to analyze that this way. I need to work out a new way to do that. I continue to do that. It's incredibly exciting. As I said, 47 years ago, I was unbelievably excited. The only thing I can tell you is that 47 years on, I'm even more excited. And I'm particularly excited about being here today because I think the fact that we as a civil service and the policy profession in particular are really understanding this need to work together, to develop new policy, to work together to get really strong evidence to make policy which impacts on the lives of all our fellow citizens isn't that worth driving in the sun to Newport to talk about? I am so excited. But before I do any more, I have to tell you a bit about this morning. In just a moment, I'm going to introduce you to three fantastic panelists, and they're going to speak for a few minutes about what drives them in this agenda. Then I will share a short discussion. I'll ask a few questions, but critically then it's over to you, the colleagues right around our nation, over 2,000 of you and counting, who wish to ask questions and who wish to engage, and let's get a really, really super good conversation going. So don't be shy to use that Slido. You've got the number, and we'll get through as many questions as we can. So welcome. This is fantastic to be able to be here now. The London office of the Office for National Statistics is at 2MS. And often when I'm in 2MS, I walk past Emma Payne, looking incredibly industrious and incredibly thoughtful. And so it's an absolute pleasure to be able to introduce Emma, who's going to be our first speaker. Emma, over to you.
Thank you so much. It's really, really brilliant to be here this morning, and really looking forward to the discussion and all of the questions. Just to introduce myself quickly, I'm Emma Payne. I am the Director for Social Housing and Resettlement in the Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities, based in 2MS, as Ian has just said, in London. And over the last 18 months, I've been working on the Homes for Ukraine scheme, which many of you might be familiar with. And it has been a really fantastic opportunity to bring together work and thinking on policy, delivery, comms, and critically analysis and data to drive a programme which has had really, really significant real world impacts. And so it's fantastic to be part of this conversation this morning about how we use analysis in policymaking. Just to say a couple of things quickly before the other panelists come in about how we've thought about data and analysis in the Homes for Ukraine programme. We have had from the start actually an embedded data and analysis team working alongside those thinking about the policy and the delivery, which has driven a real kind of analytical first approach to the way that we've been thinking about the policy. And what it's enabled us to do is incrementally over time improve and innovate as we've got better and better data and analysis coming through. The programme itself is very innovative, and it was set up at rapid pace back in March 2022 in response to the invasion of Ukraine. And since then, it's seen over 130,000 Ukrainians come to the UK. And data as part of it's been critical. We've needed data in terms of actually how we set up the scheme initially and making sure that data has flowed from the different partners on the scheme, including central government and local government. So there's been a real kind of data infrastructure element to what we've been doing. We've also needed to understand and analyse the data about who has been coming to the UK through the scheme, thinking about demographic data, regional data, and thinking about how we bring that together and present it and use it to understand where we should be kind of innovating in our policy and delivery work. And we've also been really lucky actually to work with Ian and his team at the ONS to understand more and more about how the scheme is operating on the ground, and survey data in particular that we've been able to gather about the experience that Ukrainian guests and sponsors in the UK have had. That has really had an impact on us being able to refine and develop our policy. And hopefully we can talk a bit more about that as we get into the discussion as things go through. The final thing I'll just mention by way of intro remarks is the kind of power of working cross-government on data and analysis as well has been really beneficial in thinking about this particular programme. We've worked really closely with colleagues in Department for Education, HMRC, DWP, the Treasury and more to really bring together different bits of data, different analysis, that we can get a really, really strong sense of the kind of multitude of different issues that we need to think about. And that's been really, really powerful. I'll pause there, but really looking forward to the discussion.
Emma, thank you very much. The only thing I would add is that looking over time at some of the various surveys that we have been privileged to do, we've been able to see the real benefits of your work as people changed their views on the support and everything they were getting. And I just think that scheme has been brilliant. So thank you for that. And we move on to Liz McEwen, who I also regularly see when I am in London at 2MS, and who holds such an enormous brief that I have no idea what she's going to talk about now, but I know it will be inspirational. Liz.
Thank you very much, Ian, and good morning, everyone. I'm really pleased to be here and talking about analysis at the heart of policymaking. I can't go back 47 years, but it was about over 20 years ago when I joined the civil service as a fast stream economist then. And I joined because I wanted to put analysis and economics at the heart of policymaking. And I think that's guided my career ever since. And it makes my current job as Director of Public Policy Analysis at the Office for National Statistics a bit of a dream job where I can really do that every day. And it's nice to be sort of, so to speak, sandwiched between Emma and Dan, because actually over the last year we've worked closely in both their areas. to make sure that the statistics, the analysis, the insight that we have at the Office of National Statistics is really helping making decisions both in central government, but also by the public and by policymakers across the UK. So the Ukraine humanitarian survey that Emma has just been talking about was an absolute privilege to work on, and one where I know analysts in ONS who created and developed that survey, they could then see actually how that was really feeding into decision making at the other end. And then previewing, I hope not stealing the thunder of Dan, working closely with colleagues in the HMT and across government more broadly to look at inactivity following the pandemic, getting a much better understanding of why people are leaving the labour market, whether they might return and what might affect their decisions to return, which fed into decisions at the budget in the spring. And I think both of those are good examples of a point that Emma's already drawn out, that these days the issues that we are facing, the policy questions we are facing, they're very horizontal in nature. And we as government continue to be organised vertically in departments. And that, I think, puts a real emphasis and a need for all of us to do that join up horizontally. And one of the roles that I'm also privileged to have is I co-chair what's called the Departmental Directors of Analysis Network, of which Dan is a member and the Treasury representative on. And that brings together directors of analysis from right across government. And when we're facing the big issues of the day, at the moment, a real focus on cost of living, for instance, that ability to bring expertise from across government together, to understand subject knowledge expertise, to understand the questions that we're trying to answer and how we can best work together analytically to have the best possible evidence base to support it is really important. We saw that, I think, more than ever during the time of the pandemic. It was absolutely vital then to work across departments, to think not just of the health impacts of the pandemic, but the social impacts, the economic impacts, and make sure that all the relevant evidence and insights are feeding through. And I think that approach, has intensified and gone further as we've thought about the issues affecting the cost of living. And, we need to keep being agile and think, what are the next issues that are going to be affecting the country, and how can we as analysts make sure that decision makers have got the evidence at the right time to make the best possible decisions for the country. That's hugely motivating agenda, I think, for analysts and government. And we do it best when we work with all of you as policymakers, and we do, from the start, understanding the questions and the issues you're trying to face, and then working collaboratively with analysis to help get to the best possible solutions. So I will pause there from introductory remarks, but very much looking forward to the discussions that are going to take place. Thanks, Ian.
Liz, no, thank you very much. And just in case people thought that everything happened in 2MS, well, actually, most things happen in 2MS, but at the end of the day, they don't all. And I'm delighted to move for the first time out of 2MS to Dan Gallagher, who does so much in the Treasury. And Dan, over to you.
Thanks, Ian, and thanks for having me along and the invitation. It's a pleasure and a privilege to speak to so many people about data and analysis and how we can work together with policymakers. So I'm Director of Economics at the Treasury. I've been in that role since February this year. It's been a time when the macroeconomy has been probably a bit too exciting, if I'm honest. It's nicer when things are strong and stable, but we're not quite in that place. I've spent the bulk of my career, and that career, I'm more in the Liz camp than the Ian camp. This month is my 20th year in the civil service. I've spent the bulk of that time thinking about the UK economy in aggregate. So I started off looking at the household sector, GDP, inflation, the labour markets, always on the macro side. And much of my early career was spent on forecasting, producing the government's official economic forecast before the creation of the OBR. I'll come back to that in a minute. I've spent a bit of time overseas, headed up our embassy's economic section in Washington, which gave me, the same sort of macro lens, slightly more policy and a lot of representational responsibility, but with a different economy, which was fascinating. And then latterly, over the last sort of 18 months or so, leading on fiscal policy, and then back to the Treasury's economics group, which is my sort of spiritual home, and been a real anchor for me. I think, just to presage my introductory remarks, the data and analysis side of things, the data we receive from the ONS and so many other data providers, it's not just the ONS, government departments with administrative data, but also the private sector. We really saw that through the pandemic. Just utterly critical. Macroeconomists in the Treasury elsewhere would have very little to say without it. And so it is totally foundational, the understanding of the data, the methods by which it's collected, what it can actually tell you before you get to your sort of professional judgment. But that on its own is not sufficient. It's a common understanding and a common language and a way of talking amongst policymakers and analysts and through to decision makers, our ministers. Because otherwise you will just talk past each other. And so those two things together have really provided me with something I've carried through my career. And it's been one of the things that I've been relatively successful at, is being able to explain data in a way which is salient. So I wanted to give a bit more a sort of practical example of that and some of the process we've gone through just to sort of support the conversation and your questions. I'll start off on the cost of living pressures that we've seen over the last 2 years, really. And, you know, I spent most of my time through the early phase of that thinking about the inflation shock that we were seeing as a forecaster, and we still do gentle bits of forecasting in the Treasury despite the existence of the OBR, thinking about how the shock was going to play out in aggregate inflation and what that could tell us. So we knew that this was something that was going to affect every household, every business, every person up and down the country. We knew nobody had expected it. Nobody was forecasting before the build-up of Russian troops on the border with Ukraine that there would be an energy crisis. And even when that happened, the sharpness of the increase in European energy prices just wasn't expected. But inflation, of course, then is a slightly lagging indicator. We can see these things coming, actually. It's unusual in terms of an economic shock. And then we can use the framework of the statistics that are produced, internationally comparable framework, to help us think about the shock and the sort of policy responses. So there's the combination of models that we run, thinking about the different elements of the ONS's CPI basket, food prices, energy, core inflation, many things which you've been hearing much more about in the news and in your policy work for a long time. And we can combine that with other statistics, both the OPN survey that the ONS run, the business impact survey, great developments through the pandemic that have been expanded to provide more colour and salience for policymakers to really help that statistics and analysis resonate. And on in to see the indirect effects of energy inflation onto food, things that really have affected people beyond the initial shock. It's obviously complicated by the global recovery from the pandemic, and so it's knotty. You have to work pretty hard and you exercise a huge amount of judgment about what the statistics can tell you, and then support policymakers in understanding that. The rush to jump to conclusions in these crisis moments is pretty difficult to resist, but always being humble about what we know and how that might evolve. And then going ever further deeper, getting to the household effects, thinking about that, how that can help you tailor the sorts of support that was just dramatically necessary and that government only is able to provide, but how you can do that in the best way for the macroeconomy, with the administrative tools that you've got. And we don't have a perfect set of data and we don't have a perfect set of tools there. But how far can we get along that journey? And like Liz said, how can you iterate over time? And then bring it together with other shocks. So Liz mentioned the sharp falls that we've seen in inactivity, which started to play back in through the labour market once people saw the prices rising, started pushing up wage demands, and with little slack in the labour market and people exiting, you see those second round effects in macroeconomic terms coming through. So you start to think more in a systems perspective, and the data can help you there feed back into policy. So look, utterly critical. Shocks that affect everybody up and down the country, shocks that affect our colleagues that we work with in ways, that really personal experience can add to the data in ways that can make it resonate for the policy making process and then on to decision makers. I'll stop there. Ian, back to you.
Dan, thank you very much. And so Colleagues, I hope you feel we've had 3 really exciting introductions, and I'm going to start with some conversations, but at the same time, we've already had some really exciting questions coming in. And I was going to ask a question of Liz around how the analysis function, cutting right across government, was able properly to ensure that it was inputting. But Jonathan on the chat has asked a question on Slido, which says, how do we ensure that we've got the same baseline information right across government? If 3 departments are working on broadly the same thing and the numbers are perhaps a bit different, that's not a great place to start, perhaps. So I just thought I'd start with Liz and then maybe come to you, Dan and Emma, because I think it is something that you'll have faced. I mean, Emma, particularly if you think about Ukraine, with you inspirationally told us about different departments being involved. Well, you need to make sure you've got some join up, I might have thought. But Liz, what do you think?
Yeah, you absolutely have to make sure there's some join up, and often the first stage is that drawing together of the evidence that different departments hold, testing where there's differences and come to that shared view. And I think on cost of living, on the recent labour market issues, and definitely throughout the pandemic, that was absolutely vital. In practical terms, that happens in different ways. It happens, I guess, strategically at the departmental director analysis network that I mentioned, but that's often just a starting point. And at working level, people will come together. They'll do that testing. What do we know? What don't we know is often really important as well. And on the things that we don't know, who's best placed to help fill those gaps? What does it look like to do so? Sometimes you do have conflicting information or partial information. You might have information from a range of different data sources that are less high quality than you would want to. How do you then make the judgments about what you can and can't infer from what you have? And I think that's where the analysis function really kind of comes into its own. It's all about making sure that we have consistent standards right across the piece. So within the analysis function, there's different analytical professions. Economists, statisticians, social researchers, they all have standard guidance for how they operate. So an economist working in one department will be following the Green Book in the same way as an economist working in another department. The same with social researchers in the Magentic Book, and so on. So people are coming with their same professional standards. And the important thing is to come together across departments at an early stage, take stock. What do we know? What's the evidence telling us? Where might we have a bit of tension? How can we resolve that so that we can get to that shared evidence base? And when we have that shared evidence base, that's what we should be taking to ministers, other decision makers. This is our collective view on the situation at the moment. These are how we can answer the questions that you are posing. And it's really incumbent, I think, on us as analysts to work together and work in a very open and transparent way across departments. And I think sometimes sometimes that's easier than other times. I think we've learned a lot in recent years about how to do that really well, but we're still learning. I think there's still improvements that we can make there. And I know myself and the other directors of analysis, it's something that we talk about a lot, about how we can optimize that working together on the big, complex and often kind of cross-cutting issues that we're facing now.
Liz, thank you. Emma, did you have anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, a couple of things. It's a really great question, and I agree with everything that Liz has said. I mean, like so much of the work we do across the civil service, it's really important we don't look at things in a silo, and we absolutely find the opportunities to bring work together across all departments. The things that I found have been particularly helpful on the Ukraine work that I was talking about have been firstly identifying the departments that would have an interest and data to contribute or analysis to contribute, and building those relationships actually is just almost the first step along the way, and then setting in place whatever kind of governance or regular forums are needed to make sure that we're working in lockstep with each other. And then it's also been really powerful to think about how we bring all of the different bits of data together in a way that can be understood and communicated. And we've worked quite hard on dashboards, for example, where we can bring together a range of different types of data so that everyone has access to that and can work with the same baseline. That feels really important. But then in addition to that, as Liz was saying, there'll be some elements of data that we've probably got more confidence in than others. So being really clear as we bring data together and kind of establish that baseline, what is our confidence level of the different types of data, and not necessarily rejecting the data that we don't have high confidence in, but being very careful about understanding the limitations of it, so that anyone who is drawing on that data to feed into policy work or delivery work absolutely knows how they can use that and where the risks or caveats might be. So those are some of the things that I've found have been particularly helpful. But I think the general kind of concept of trying to bring together as much of a coalition of departments who have got an interest in an issue as possible, and then absolutely maintaining that through a piece of work is really fundamental across policy work and absolutely also across the analytical work.
Brilliant, Emma. Fantastic. Thank you so much. Dan?
I mean, I agree with everything that Liz and Emma have said. The way I would build on that is in ensuring that when you go out and make those connections across departments, that you are open and humble. You know, I sit in the Treasury. I have 100 excellent macroeconomists working for me in the economics group. And I guarantee that when we go and have conversations with departments, DWP, HMRC, ONS, the Joint Data and Analysis Centre in Cabinet Office, DBT colleagues, we learn something every single time. And that comparison of our view, of our interpretation of the data always changes. It always changes. There's expertise out there in micro realms that will change our interpretation of the macro data. I think the other thing to just have in mind, including building on Emma's point about the confidence levels, is don't be afraid to challenge the data. So, you know, there are other sources that allow you to think about the errors around the data, the standard errors in data, and may cause you to think further about the signals that it's giving you. So even the highest quality data can change over time, and its interpretation with other sources can change. And that's my point earlier about really getting to understand the methods. As an analyst who isn't a statistician, someone whose job is to interpret and advise on the basis of the data and work with policy colleagues, really getting into the statistical domain and understanding how the data is collected, processed, and how time is critical. Understanding really comes with that openness and sharing your view, your assessment, to make sure that you're getting all the possible input.
Thanks, Dan. Really critical points again, you know, particularly about this is an interactive experience and not being shy about asking questions. I was going to talk next about inclusion, but Emma raised a point that I was going to come to later, but I'm going to come back to it now. And it really, I think, can be encapsulated as in the 21st century, in the decade we're in now, where we can do things that I could have only dreamt about decades ago. What are data? What are data? And critically, how do we, if you like, navigate between them? In the chat, Chris, or on Slido, Chris asked a question, which is, how do we navigate demand for changing uses of data? And increasingly, we're using administrative data, which, of course, are collected for administrative purposes, not to answer research questions. So how do we navigate ourselves across different sources of data? And how do we, if you like, almost take judgments about whether the data really do answer the question? And are there different types of data we ought to be thinking about that perhaps we're not thinking enough about? Emma, you raised that question in my brain, so I'll come to you first. I hope you don't mind.
No, I don't mind at all. It's a really great question, and I think one of the things that we're actually lucky to have is access to lots and lots of different sources. But the challenge that then comes with that is, how do we bring those together, and how do we work through which sources we can rely upon which sources should feed into policy advice, which sources should feed into decisions. And I think in a way that is something that needs to be worked through kind of constantly. And one of the benefits, I think, of having really close working between policy and analysis is you can have that kind of real-time discussion about how are all of these different sources coming together. One of the things that, and this might be slightly kind of veering away from the question, but one of the things that I think is actually very important is to make sure that analysts are involved in almost thinking about what the questions are at the start of a process. So it's not always necessarily helpful just for the initial thinking to be done in the policy team and then to commission out to analysts and then bring it back together. Actually having that kind of co-design of what is it we're trying to understand, what is it we're trying to answer, and therefore what might be the different sources of data that we bring together feels really fundamental and something that I've really valued being able to do. I think you also asked the question about, is there more out there? Is there more that we should be trying to bring in that we're not? And I'm sure the answer is probably yes. And we should all be challenging ourselves to keep thinking and keep testing ourselves on, are there other things that we should be thinking about? Are there other ways of bringing in data? And we are obviously lucky to have access to an awful lot of different data streams. So I think we should absolutely keep challenging ourselves on that.
Thank you. That's great. Liz, do you have a view?
I absolutely do have a few. Yes, thanks, Ian. I mean, I think it's never been a more exciting time to be an analyst. The range of data sources that we can make use of now is, unsurpassed in time. And the challenge then is is exactly as Emma was articulating there, how to make use of all those different sources in the best possible way. I think first there's a sort of creativity to kind of understand what data sources might help. So at the moment, we already talked on this call about the cost of living challenges. How can data coming from financial transactions help us understand that? That's data that we wouldn't have had access to in the past. We now can have access to that data. But I think then, going on to how Emma put it, what are the questions people are asking? How can actually that data help us understand patterns across the country in ways that we haven't been able to understand before? And so we've got to evolve how we're asking questions at the same time as how we evolve making use of a wider range of data sources. And then I think the question that our colleague Chris asked does matter. If data is being collected originally for other purposes, then analysts haven't had control of the setup necessarily of the creation of that data. And so more work has to be done, I think, to kind of understand the quality limitations of it, to understand what it is, what it can and can't tell us. And then for analysts to be able to offer to policymakers a nuanced view of the insight you can gain from the data. And I think importantly, the insight you can't gain from it. And I think as the sort of range of data sources proliferate, it's very exciting. I think it means that we can answer questions we haven't been able to answer before, and do so in a much more timely way than previously. But it brings new challenges for analysts, and it brings new challenges for policymakers as well, to understand the range of different information and how it should be used in policymaking. So it's evolving very quickly, the range of data sources we're using and how we're using them. The dialogue between policymakers and analysts, I think, more important than ever in making best use of that data, and doing so from the beginning when we're first thinking about what are the questions we're wanting to address here.
Brilliant. Dan, anything to add?
So I just on the sort of practical applications, I think Liz's point that it is getting harder is right. There is more data, and more people are conscious of it. The pandemic in particular saw an explosion of private sector organisations being extremely helpful through publishing their own data, which could provide some insights. The ONS did a fantastic job of bringing selections of that together, bringing it into your own statistics, and making sure that there were sort of clear explanations and standards of what it was and what it isn't, which is critical. But it also leads to that sort of the rush of some policy decision makers, ministers in particular, can be guilty of this, of spotting a certain thing and taking it out of context. And so that ability to keep up both in the policy making process, but also the confidence to dismiss data through that understanding of what it is and the new methods that we have is critical. And again, that's something where the discussion between people making and advising on the policy and the analysts bringing the data and analysis to that process has to be continuous. It has to be from the start. Because otherwise it can lead to mistakes. And to share, through the early phase of the cost of living crisis, various energy interventions were considered in the Treasury, and some of those ran ahead of the analytical process, and the join up wasn't always perfect. Lots of weekend working, lots of demands at pace from private office because of the sort of critical nature of the situation. And sometimes there were moments where analysts were intervening to say, you know what, there are problems in this space, either in the way that the interpretation is done, the questions that are being asked of the data, or the feedback effects that, actually taking a certain policy decision will cause classification issues in data, or cause strange effects in the future of inflation statistics, which actually have wider policy implications, and they're not being brought into the discussion at the moment. So that early discussion and learning from those experiences is just critical in how we use these administrative data sets and the new things that are available to us.
Dan, thank you very much. And you raised something that I'm going to come back to in about a question and a half time, because a really important question from Miriam in Slido that I want to come to. If I could just, in that last question, abuse the chair quickly and put a word in for qualitative data, which I do think is incredibly important. And look, 30 years ago, I read a paper in the Journal for Market Research Society, which is called something like, I can't remember, Integrating Qualitative and Quantitative Data. And the bottom line was, the paper didn't need to be read because it was all in the first sentence, which was basically, it's hard. And my view that it is hard is still there, but I still think we should be really trying to do it. You learn an enormous amount from qualitative data, and you should really look at it. And the second point, we move on, Chris, another Chris in Slido has asked a question about using AI in analysis and the potential for AI. And I'll just kick off very quickly. The potential for AI is enormous, no question. But, and there is a real but here, something that I have both demonstrated and I'm passionate about, AI does not mean you can avoid knowing a lot about the analysis and the subject you are studying. If you just think you could get some data, press a button, and some magic thing will come back and tell you what the answer is, you will be in a position that I was in once when an undergraduate student I was teaching came up to me and said, though I found out that the modal age at childbearing in the UK is now 8. And I said, why do you say that? And the student very carefully said, well, the computer told me. And I said, well, can you forget the computer and think about the biology? And, it is so I'm absolutely 100% AI, incredibly important. Angela McLean, the government chief scientific advisor, and I are chairing a panel on it. And Liz, you were there. I thought it was a very good discussion. But you need to know what you are talking about, and you need to understand the social theory that you are working with. And that means policy professionals working closely with analysts. Having thrown and completely abused the chair, Emma, would you like to talk about the use of AI?
I'm not sure I've got a huge amount to add to what you've said, Ian. I mean, I expect the opportunities are really vast, and I think there'll be a lot for us all to think about how do we upskill ourselves, and as you say, how do we understand the opportunities but also the limitations and the risks, and make sure that we are kind of keeping up with the pace of that. So I think those are probably my points to add.
Thanks. Dan, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, just on, I mean, it's actually related techniques, because the world of data science, which stretches into AI, has huge power and is already being used extensively across government. I mean, in our own space, the ability to process and in thinking about the very near-term outlook for the UK economy, all these new and novel data sources that have come about is only supported by things like machine learning. Taking the time out of repetitive analytical pipeline type activity, things that we do again and again, processing, cleaning, and integrating new different frequency data and some qualitative data, as Surya mentioned, into our models, has led to more time spent with policy colleagues talking about the insights, talking about the questions they would like to ask, and providing the professional judgment of the results out of the back end. You've really got to understand the methods. And I mean, I would suggest for thinking about how policy colleagues, non-analysts, engage with these topics and methods, it really is something to look at. Going on the short courses that the ONS offer, sort of introductory to become that intelligent customer, is critical for some of these techniques. On AI specifically, and an analytical approach, but to more of a policy activity, actually, the Treasury as a department, we have started using AI to process and triage our incoming correspondence, for instance. And our excellent data science team, led by John Kelly, who's based at the Darlington Economic Campus in Yorkshire, is able to think about techniques that, again, can remove repeatable tasks out of the process, even in the policy space, because it is data-like, and do so in a very secure environment. So remember, some of the tools that are available generally and publicly learn from the information you give them. You need to be in a secure environment if you're processing protected information that your department holds, and those tools are beginning to become available in departments as well. Thanks.
Dan, thank you very much. Liz, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, just 2 quick points, if I may, and about, I guess, how analysts are using AI at the moment. So I think I said earlier that one of the things that we want to do across the analysis function is make sure that analysis is being done to consistent standards right across the piece. And that is as true of AI as it is of any other analytical techniques that we might want to use. So we've kick-started some work to think really how best to quality assure analytical work done using AI. It's very early stages. My colleague Osama Rahman, who is the director of the data science campus, is leading that work. I think really essential, so that we know that when we're using AI in our analysis, we're using it in the best possible way, we're assuring it in the best possible way, and that we can give confidence to policymakers on the insights that we're finding from it. So there's that on the one hand, and I think on the other hand, how we as analysts are thinking about AI is the impacts of AI on the economy, on the society, on productivity within the public sector and beyond, and framing the questions that we want analytical responses to, and built, again, just as we've discussed in relation to other topics, in relation to AI, can we get to that shared evidence base on the big questions that people are asking about AI? Can we bring in different expertise, the economic expertise that resides right across the piece, but equally in the Treasury and with Dan and colleagues? Can we bring in different expertise from across the piece and begin to answer those questions in a collective way that makes best use of our expertise and keeps pace with what is a very fast evolving area of policy? Thanks, Ian.
Brilliant. No, thanks, Liz. Now, look, I said a little while ago in about a question and a half time, I was going to come to Miriam's question, which I think is a really, really good one, and I wanted to make sure that we had plenty of time to discuss it. And Dan, you mentioned it when you were talking about the development of policy around energy in many ways, when you said that sometimes the policy was getting ahead of the analysis. And, you know, Miriam, I think quite insightfully asks, how do you manage the balance between complex and nuanced analysis and the policymakers' demand for simple answers I might add, often very quickly. But she then asks often to help them support their pre-existing preferences. So, some quite challenging questions there from Miriam. Dan, do you have a view?
Yes. I might turn to the pandemic actually. And through 2020 and 2021, with colleagues like Joe Key, who's now over at DLUC and was at the time in the Cabinet Office, and Joanna Cowan at the Cabinet Office, I spent a large proportion of my life briefing the Chancellor and the Prime Minister weekly and then monthly on the very high frequency data we were getting on the state of the economy and the response of people in their everyday lives and livelihoods to both the restrictions that were being put in place by the government, the progress of the pandemic itself, and then through to the economic data and how we expected it to emerge. That was hellishly complex, frankly, because we were learning along the way, and the demand for simple answers, communicable to the public, was very high. On the second part of your question, and I'll take that first, Miriam. My clear approach with the Chancellor and the Prime Minister is to be honest and straight. We have data. The public can see that data. There are lots of other external economists and bodies assessing it as well. And so not giving it to them straight only harms their own credibility. And at moments where that's challenging, reminding them of that is a core part of our jobs, working with their private office and special advisors to do that. You've got to do it in a way where you're not just, and this is a lovely Sam Beckett phrase, a bad newsreader. We can give them the news in the data, but also come to what it means and how to address it. And if with your policy colleagues, you can give that joint message of, okay, this is where we are, and this is what we can do, because we understand your objectives, and the data may be going in this direction, but this is how we can react to that to get back to your objectives. That would typically always guide my approach. And I survived, I think, 46 prime ministerial briefings on the economy through that period to come out the other side. And I'm very proud of that. Complex and nuanced to the simple. I think the key way that I think about this is how do you make that complex and nuance resonate? And in a salient way. One part of my career that I didn't mention is I spent a year in the Treasury's press office as the senior economy spokesperson, and I've always had an analytical anchor. I've never wanted to work in a private office directly with ministers, but I'm privileged enough that the Treasury has a senior economist to explain the economic data to economic journalists, and so that gave me a sense of how to communicate effectively in these things. The sort of relatable example. So I think one of my triumphs in this was really getting cut through with the then Prime Minister about how rising oil prices would affect the average family. And it literally was as simple as looking up the volume capacity of a Vauxhall Astra's petrol tank and explaining the change in the cost of filling that tank up. And suddenly he got it. And he could really take that out. And it's a fairly simple example. It's not particularly complex, but a good example of how you can really land key points from analysis is boiling it down to something that is totally relatable to your friends in any walk of life who don't work in government.
And that's so incredibly important. I get very stressed when people, I've sat in meetings and someone says the answer, beta equals 6.7. Well, okay, great. Now can we move that down to what it means to the person on the street? Emma, I'm going to come to you next, but I wonder if you might also at the same time, address a really interesting question that's come from Cheryl on Slido, which asked, do you ever find it challenging to balance the need for analysis and statistics within policy work with your own emotions? And Cheryl, speaks specifically to Homes for Ukraine. And I just wondered if you might like to wrap that into your thoughts.
Thank you. Look, two really, really good and important questions. And I'll try and cover both of them, because there actually probably are some parallels as you think about both of those questions. And I completely agree with what Dan has said, and he's given some really, really good insights on that kind of challenge of almost filtering complexity down to something that is understandable and kind of communicable. Coming from the kind of policy perspective on this, I think there is an onus on those of us working in policy to really take the time to try and understand the complexities and the nuance of the analysis and keep an open mind, to try and avoid having those kind of pre-existing kind of answers before the analysis has helped us work through what the options might actually be. And I think that relates a little to Cheryl's question as well about how to balance the kind of your own emotions and the analysis. And there's something there about trying to keep an open mind. Not always that easy to do, but really important that we absolutely try to do that, I think, as we think about policy. One of the things, going back to the kind of the first question about how do we kind of make sure that we're really building that complexity and nuance into our thinking. For me, a lot of that actually also comes down to how we communicate simply. And there's a challenge and a question on all of us. I think there's something really powerful about when policy and analysis works together, to think about how do you communicate something incredibly complicated in a way that those making decisions or making the kind of policy recommendations can understand it. And different things might work for different audiences. I think the power of good charts can't be kind of understated. And we will have all, we've all saw so many different charts during the pandemic. And as has been said by some of the other panelists, the kind of country as a whole has had a real exposure to kind of reading charts and understanding visualizations of data. I think one of the questions for us now is how do we almost build on that in our policy thinking and bringing that analysis into our policy work to think about, are there visual ways to demonstrate complexity? And we've thought about that quite a lot in the Homes for Ukraine programme, thinking about how you use heat maps, how you use charts to show changes over time, and I think that can be really powerful. So I would really kind of encourage thinking about that. And just going back again to the second question about the kind of the emotions, and actually some of this links to the question about qualitative and quantitative data. One of the things that's been really important for us in Homes for Ukraine is not just purely to rely on a data feed, but to also understand how things are feeling for people. And so what we have tried to do is have a whole range of different insights coming into our work. Some has been the survey evidence that I talked about briefly, which the ONS has really helped us with, that gives us a sense of actually how are things feeling for sponsors and for guests. But we have also overlaid onto that some more insight from actually going out and talking ourselves to those who are using the scheme. And that's been really, really rich and powerful, I think, in terms of really understanding how things feel. And I think that's important to bring that kind of more personal context in for some areas of policy as well. You need to manage it kind of carefully and understand the limitations and the caveats of the different sources of insight that are being brought together. But I think there are programmes of work that we do in government where it's really important to understand the impact that it is having at the human level, and finding ways to bring that in to the thinking. But as I said at the very outset, keeping that open mind so that we can really develop our policy options in line with what that is all telling us is really fundamental.
Emma, that's so important. And I've never found it difficult to admit that I will change my mind, from my initial thinking, if the data really are going in a particular direction. Liz, I wanted to come to you now, and I wondered if you could also wrap in the way that Emma just did so brilliantly. Another question, and we got a really interesting question in Slido from Georgina, who asks about whether you've got any advice on how to demonstrate the inclusion of long-term analysis. You know, for example, effects of policy on a greater than 10-year timescale when you're informing policies designed to address issues metaphorically for tomorrow afternoon. Liz, you're on mute.
It had to happen at some point, didn't it?
Somebody had to.
Today it's me. Really good question from Georgina there on the impact of long-term thinking. I actually think here analysts have got a huge contribution to play. I think we can more often create the space to do some of that long-term analysis, to do some of that long-term thinking, and to have that available for policymakers at the point when they're making more short-term decisions. And I think it comes as well to the question earlier about having kind of consistent assumptions about topics across government as well. I think it's sort of incredibly important that we understand the long-term trends in the country and what they tell us. Ian, I know you might want to pick up yourself about presentations you've given on how demographic trends are going to play out and what that means for policymaking. And we need to understand what that looks like over the next 10, 20 years, because that's fundamentally going to affect public policy in that period. And I guess sort of to combine that question with the sort of with the question about how can it's the same sort of, it's kind of related to the question about how do you manage against the simple and the complex. And often there's a word that I kind of use in all these circumstances, proportionality. So it's kind of what are the demands at that moment in time, and how can you bring the best information to them? And sometimes we need to be looking ahead. We need to know what issues might arise, and then that gives you time to do some of that long-term thinking, some of that long-term analysis. So when the short-term decisions are happening, you're already well placed and well prepared to do that. So I think there's definitely things that we can do in that space. And then I think it's understanding that sometimes a very sort of, you don't have much time to do analysis. You don't have much time to do it, and some analysis is better than nothing at that point. But, and this is where I think it comes back to the really helpful advice that Dan and Emma gave about how you kind of present and communicate analysis at those points, and that really matters. And I would echo the sort of we've had some of our analysts go to the BBC during the election period and work in the studios then supporting, and they've come back in with that sort of with huge skills and experience during that period of how to address kind of analytical questions when the window is short, and do so with the right degree of accuracy and quality appropriate to the time available to answer the question. And as I was coming in this morning, I was reading about Ross Atkins' book, The Art of Explanation, on the way in. And I think that he's just written. And I think actually how we explain things clearly, both as policymakers and analysts, we've all got learning to do there, but that can make all the difference, I think. Thanks, Ian.
Thanks very much. Look, the very last answer is going to come from Emma, and it's going to have to be really short. But Lucy's asked a question which refers to Emma and says, Emma talked about having analysts embedded in her team. Do you think integrating analysts into policy teams would create closer working and support evidence-based policy making? Yes, no, and no more than one sentence.
I think regardless of where analysts sit, policy and analysis should work as closely as possible together. I think you can do that across team boundaries or within an embedded team. But the absolutely fundamental thing, I think, is to work as one team as much as possible.
Brilliant, Emma. Now, look, my briefing for today was that I absolutely had to finish on time, and that in the last 2 minutes I had to do a couple of things. So what I'm going to do in the last now 1 minute is firstly answer a question which comes from Hannah, who says, how can we best frame our requests for data? And the answer is think about careful questions. There is nothing worse than being asked to say something interesting about something. I could say something interesting about most subjects in government, to me, they'd be interesting. They might be completely useless to you. So asking questions is incredibly important. Can I just finish in the remaining 30 seconds by thanking so much Emma, Liz, and Dan for really partaking so inspirationally. Could I thank everybody on this call for being part of this policy festival and asking such really insightful and incisive questions. I think it's been a great conversation, and just I am going to have to let you know that within 2 hours, I'm assured, this will be available for on the government equivalent of the iPlayer or whatever, so that it can be revisited. Can I just thank Dan, Liz, and Emma one more time on your behalf? What a great conversation. Thank you.